by Taehan. The header is good, and it's the giant defender John Taehan, and eventually Korea have broken the deadlock.
You're listening to the K-League United podcast, proud partner of Football Nation Radio.
My name is Ryan Walters here for the K-League United podcast, and I am not joined by Matthew Binns, Scott Whitelock, or Paul Neat. This is a very special edition where we are going to be focusing solely on coaching and youth development here in Korea, and we've got a lot to talk about. We were talking a little bit about this before we came on, so I'm just going to introduce these gentlemen, and we are going to hop into this because I'm pretty excited to talk about these things. So first, we've got Tom Orrock, the CEO of Wae-In Sports.
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. Tom reached out recently at one of the watch parties, and we got to talking, and he said that I had to talk to the other man that is here today, Taehan, who is a performance analyst and lecturer. He said that you're somebody that has a lot of opinions about managing here.
I am.
So I'm excited to talk about it. And again, we've kind of been messaging a little bit. We've been talking about this for a while. So we're going to be talking about youth development, tactics, lower division football, and then we're going to end with something that we talk about a lot when we talk internationally. We're going to talk about Confucian culture here in Korean football. But first, and Tom, because you and I connected first, I'll start with you. So for the listeners out there, what are you up to here in Korea?
Yeah, so my name is Tom Orrock. I'm a professional or ex-professional rugby player. I've since done my SRU and UEFA badges in football coaching. I came over to Korea several years ago with the idea to learn a little bit about the culture and challenge myself. That started out coaching very young ages, and I've coached all the way up to K3. And more recently, I set up my company Wae-In Sports, which is based in the UK, but we also do business here in Korea. And that's focused around youth development, coach education, and player education as well. So everything from curriculums to helping coaches find their value and also working with the League Association on their development.
Yeah, and you've been working with some really notable names in Korean football at Wae-In, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I've been very fortunate to work with Hong Min-bo on several things, not just his academy, but also on his step into the KFA as well. He's a fantastic character and somebody who I owe a lot to for introducing me to a lot of big names in the country.
I'm one of the few people I think that was introduced to him during his time with the LA Galaxy.
Oh, really? From his playing days?
From his MLS days, and that's when he popped up on my radar. So I can't hear his name without thinking LA Galaxy, but that's not what most people that are listening are going to think of.
I do have a fond first memory of him in my RE class in school during the 2002 World Cup. Mm-hmm. I don't recall anything from that lesson other than we had a little TV on in the corner, and we were watching him smash in the winning penalty in that infamous game with Italy. So when I sat down with him, what is almost 20 years later, was quite something. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and it's a perfect segue because, Taehan, I'm sure you were pretty excited when that game went down as well. And we could talk about the 2002 World Cup all day. But beforehand, just to kind of introduce yourself to the listeners. So you're a performance analyst and a lecturer here in Korea. Who are you working with for those, and what are some of the things you're talking about and analyzing?
I used to study in Southampton Solent University in the UK for football studies, and I used to had a chance to working as performance analyst in West Ham United in the UK. So I bring kind of the concept what I studied in there to South Korea. So I luckily working with K-League and KFA to talk about how we educate player. We try to, it's not only Korean football's problem, Korean education and Korean society try to kill creativity. So I try to say what is the problem from that, and then how we can solve out.
Yeah, and that leads in perfectly to a bunch of the things that I really want to dig into, and let's just get started on the first one, which is youth development. So let's start with the youngins here. And is this an area, you just brought up creativity, which I think is so key at this age, and I know that the way that this is being done, the way that we're educating young players on how to play is changing a lot, and there's a lot of 2-on-2, 3-on-3, 5-on-5, and kind of gradually working up to the full game. But here in Korea, and Taehan, I'll start with you on that one. What is it that you are encouraging teams to look for, or kind of looking for when you're analyzing a team from the youth level? What is it here in Korea with K-League or with the KFA that you're looking for at the youth level?
I think KFA wanna have a creative player now.
Okay.
Yeah, because like I know it's hard because like a Korean society, Korean football is one part of the Korean society.
Mm-hmm.
So in that society, in that kind of maybe we're gonna talk about later about the Confucianism, but Confucianism is main tema in South Korea. So that kind of society is difficult to say your idea, especially when you see young player in South Korea. They can't talk their idea to coach. Sometimes they can talk to their senior player as well. So what I'm thinking is like if you see the A-side game from KFA, we have a special rule. Our coaches cannot speak during the game.
Oh.
Yeah, that I don't think that kinds of rule exists in another country, but
It does.
it does.
It's quite recent, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I had a meeting with the KFA, the K-League and the KFA 2 years ago about incentives for young players.
Yeah.
And it was part of the Elite Player Performance Plan set up by the English FA, 2011.
Yeah.
And over time, they've seen fantastic changes in creative opportunities for players and cycling positions. But they weren't seeing enough of the philosophy that they wanted of playing out from the back. So they changed the rules of the game. So that you had a retreat line, for instance, for goal kicks. So the opposition team would have to retreat to the halfway, which would encourage the goalkeeper, who may not be the biggest, may not be the best at striking the ball, to play short passes.
Interesting.
Yeah. So So that's absolutely right. Giving players opportunities and changing rules to give the incentive back towards the players.
Interesting. And you know what? I put it at the end just because I wanted to like end with a bang with Confucian culture, but I feel like that's something that those of us that live in Korea, it's just so ingrained in the society here that you kind of take it for granted. And I'm realizing as we're talking about it now that there are probably a lot of people that listen to the podcast that watch K-League from abroad and don't know about this. So I'm gonna put a pin in youth development right now, and I want to come back to that. But I feel like it's impossible to talk about youth development or to talk about anything else that we're going to talk about right now without talking about Confucian culture. So I think let's just dive headlong into this. And Taehan, again, you're the guy that we're going to defer to on this one. No pressure at all, just a complete society that you're trying to get here. How would you? We'll make it specific for football.
Okay.
We'll make it specific for football. How would you describe the current state of Confucian culture in football here in Korea?
Okay, I want to ask you guys first. How many years have you lived in South Korea, guys?
Tom?
Officially 3 years.
Okay.
So that's the answer I'm going to stick with.
Okay. It is 5 years for me.
So what did you feel so far about the Korean society? Do you think like Korean people talk a lot, talk well, or do you think if you see young people in the street or somewhere, do they talk to older a lot or not?
Well, not a ton, and I'll keep it. One of my best cultural introductions to Korea was football, and this is one of the things that I love about this game is that I joined an international team when I played on Goje, and we had people from all over the world. We had people from Malaysia, various European countries, all over the place, right? And we all kind of had like this one collective foreigner way of playing, right? And then we went and we played against some of the Korean teams, and we played against the colleges and the universities. Things were fine. It was a pretty contentious at times game, but like that's the game, right? And then there was one game, I think I had only been here about 2 or 3 months, and we played a team of older gentlemen, and let's just say we got a little frustrated because we weren't allowed to talk to them about some things, and they maybe got some calls from the referee every now and again. But it was frustrating at the time, but it was such a great introduction to how Confucian culture plays in here. And on that team, we had a lot of younger Korean players that when we faced that older team, we were going to them like, hey, can you help explain this? And they're like, no, I can't talk to him like that. And that was an immediate, very quick introduction that's still serving today.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you talk about the players talking to their elders, or perhaps not. But it works the other way as well. I mean, the older players will spend a lot of time passively talking to younger people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actively listening.
Right.
That was something that I had to learn by myself. When I came here, I was working in an organization with zero English language. It was incredibly difficult for me in my first year at the academy, which was perfect. I wouldn't change it for anything. But there were a lot of moments where I had to just accept the situation.
Right.
And that was very, very frustrating for me as somebody who I'm desperate to learn, and I want to understand the context of those situations. And the excuse for the most part I would get is, this is just the Korean way. And I couldn't relate to that at that time. And it's taken a lot of practice with the language that as I'm walking down the street, I can start to identify these signals happening in everyday conversation that previously you would have said, oh, this is cute, and oh, the ajumma, they all shout at each other, and don't they love each other? And now you hear the real context of what you're talking about. I've been exposed to it probably less so than yourselves, but it's in at the deep end for me as well.
Actually, what I wanna listen from you guys is like maybe it is quite different what I feel and then how you feel about the Confucianism. So actually Confucianism is kind of the social cultural background in East Asia. So not in only South Korea, it also affects on Japan and China as well. So the Confucianism teaching is about like you have your role. So father has your role and son has your role. So son has to listen father, kind of thing. So it's kind of hierarchy system. Let's talk about the school. Normally, a student cannot speak to their teacher because they feel if they speak or if they give opinion, that means like they don't respect their teacher. Because like teacher know everything, so you can't touch that line.
Right.
Yeah.
And is that something that, Tom, I know you and I have talked about this a little bit before we were recording it. Is that something, Taehan, that you feel comes into football, into practice with managers and with players? Is it that same kind of relationship?
Yeah, of course. I think that it's not problem, and sometimes it's just cultural difference. But I think when we think about the football, specific sports, it's barrier. I think it is a barrier, because if you don't speak your idea, and if you can't have your own idea on the pitch, that means like you can't play the game. So that is why I start to lecturing when I come back to South Korea, because what I feel is like we Korean people talk about like Korean football has problem with physical or something mindset kind of things. But I think the problem is we don't have a proper culture. When young people try to talk, we need to give chance, but we don't.
Tom, I feel like this is something that you're trying to work on with Wae-In here, is to try to introduce maybe a new way of thinking. Again, not necessarily a better way of thinking, just something that's a little bit different, because when we talk about K-League a lot, we talk about the coaching carousel, the manager carousel of managers that leave one team and then they come back. This is something that happened a few years ago when Gwangju was fighting against relegation. They brought in Kim Hak-bum, even though he had just gotten Sangnam relegated a few years ago. I think he's doing great things at the youth level with the national team, but it was kind of an odd choice. This year, we see Incheon United part ways with Jorn Anderson. Whatever happened there, really liked him as a manager. I don't know what happened there, and I thought he was doing some interesting things. Well, he's gone, and in comes Yoo Sang-chul, who got the Jeonnam Dragons relegated last year. So it's a little bit frustrating from a fan perspective and from a journalist perspective of people following this to see this carousel kind of keep going. And is that something that you think kind of comes down to a mentality of, well, this coach will know the culture and will be able to introduce this culture, or is it jobs for the boys, or what do you think it is?
Well, I think you need to look at the gains. So by firing one manager, perhaps they're looking for the honeymoon period. They're looking for something. They're looking for the X factor change. They're trying to make something fit. But when you're trying to make marginal gains, you need to have, for those to work, you need to have a fantastic foundation underneath those. And that's underpinned by the organization, how well it communicates, the culture within that organization. And it's nothing without having a core identity. There's no successful group on the planet that doesn't operate without a fantastic culture and core identity that every member of that organization can draw back to and gain inspiration from. And I think that's something that feeds off, that youth sports really feeds off of in Korea as well. And something that we try to work on, like you were mentioning, is it would do us no good to try and import England's elite player performance plan or the 5 great mental attributes from the TFB. They wouldn't translate. We need to respect the Korean culture and give it context. So rather than replacing that mindset, we need to augment it. So we're trying to do that by listening to the coaches and listening to CEOs. I mean, these are people who are under an immense amount of pressure. They take a lot of flack, and the majority of them don't want to be in this job. They come from professional businesses. It's not seen as a coveted job. It's a short-term job, and it's quite a thankless task. So being able to listen to everybody, all of the key decision makers, all the stakeholders, all the way down to your catering staff and your coaches as well, because those are the people who you're hoping are going to give you stability throughout. And for the youth as well, having a club with a philosophy, something that you can see on the pitch, players who have come through, developed through the youth system because they share that philosophy, is invaluable. And we see it in Europe, we see it in the Premier League, and they're fairy tale stories, and everybody unites behind that, and teams spend hundreds of millions of pounds building around these players. A great example is somebody like Phil Foden coming through now as the most exciting prospect at Man City. Look at the team that's built around him, yet he is the homegrown player that everybody's talking about. And players like in the past, Kwon Chang-hoon or Lee Jae-sung, and more recently Lee Kang-in as well. These are young players who are looking at their future and looking at the options to them, and they're just leaving. There's a talent drain. And
yeah, that's definitely something that when we talk about youth development, I really want to get into that. And we're going to get right back to that, and we're going to take a break here very shortly. No, this is again, this is the nerd conversation that I've been wanting to have about Korean football for a really long time. So hopefully the people listening are enjoying it, but it's something I've wanted to talk about for a long time. And one of the things there, though, is that with that youth development and this desire to have more homegrown talent, and Taehan, I'm going to throw this one back to you again. What changes do you think need to be implemented with the Confucian culture? And like Tom was saying, to keep it in place, because I mean, obviously there are merits to this culture that's been around for thousands of years. It's not something that I think a lot of times those of us that are foreigners looking at the sport here, it can kind of be viewed as like, oh, let's just get rid of this thing. And I don't think any of us are trying to say that, but what kind of changes do you think need to be implemented within football specifically for the communication between players and coaches, or maybe between managers and the board, or anything like that? What kind of changes do you think need to be implemented?
I think like what Korean football, and maybe we can talk about the Korean society as well. We need question. We need more question. That is, I think, the best way we can change Korean football, because as what we said before, like it's quite strict society, and then culturally very hierarchy system in Korea. So even though you are old and another people are younger than you don't want to speak, because like when you speak, that means like you try to show how you are good. When you see the Korean culture, they don't want to speak as well.
Sure.
Yeah. So what I suggest to Korean football is we need to make more question.
Okay.
Whatever on the training ground or out of the field. So I normally when I do lecturing, my lecture type is quite different than what Korean students used to have before.
Sure.
Yeah. So like my lecture is normally, firstly, I give kind of the question to students first, and then try to give chance to think by themselves. So they try to write their own answer, and then when they come to class, they have a kind of the discussion and they speak their idea. I think that is what we need in football as well.
More of a facilitator role.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So the society has changed. So we are not living in 1980s. So we live in 21st century. So we can get a lot of information on the internet. So the meaning of creativity also has changed as well. So what we need in this society is we need to know what information I need, and then we need to unify them. So that is creativity in football as well. I try to teach them. So you need to make a question because you know what is question, and then if you know what is question, that means like you know what is proper answer.
That's interesting that you say that about selecting the right information for you. Would you say that it's most important before you can, we have access, like you said, to all the information? Would you then argue that the most important thing is knowing what the end goal is?
Of course, I think, yeah. So like maybe we're gonna talk about football philosophy later, but if students or players don't know what is their goal, they can't give their own answer. Because let's talk about like if you are 16 years old center back, center half, and if you know what is your role for your team as 16 years old center half, you give your answer. You might give your answer, but if you don't know what you need to do, that means you can't give your answer.
And as it stands right now, one of the understandings that I have is that the communication between the younger players and the older players, and especially the managers, isn't necessarily there. I think one of the most shocking things that came out from the World Cup for me was when Lee Seung-woo was interviewed, and they were asking him about if he's getting advice from a lot of the older players, and he said, "Oh, I can't talk to them," which was just baffling. It was just baffling because, to me, the whole idea is to have those young players come to a tournament like the World Cup. Maybe they're not going to be the stars of the tournament. I mean, he had a fine tournament. But to me, that's so he can learn from these players by more than just watching them, because you can get tape, you can watch players that way. And is that something that, like you're saying, just encouraging more questioning, more thinking, is that the kind of thing that you're hoping to see change?
Yes, like Tom and we talk about the how we can make creative organization culture. I think if we can give the creative environment for players, like questioning is one of the method, one of type how we can do. So let's bring some educational theory we call constructivism. Constructivism means like kind of the education theory currently talk a lot from Western side. Knowledge is not only one. Knowledge can be different by people. So when you see water, sometimes people say like it's half of water, but sometimes people say like, wow, it's a lot of water. So football also similar, isn't it? So constructivism is kind of things like teacher try to give students give time to think by themselves to solve out the situation. So the questioning is one of the method. When you talk about the Lee Seung-woo, I think like he talk about his Barcelona life in there. So he said like he can speak to his coach, but in here, maybe he's not.
Right. Yeah, at the national level, it seems like that's not a conversation that's happening. But on the note of Lee Seung-woo, we're gonna have to move on a little bit from this because there are a bunch of other things that I really want to talk about. So we're gonna take a quick break, but we'll be right back.
Fans, we want to hear from you. You're encouraged to email KLU at info@kleagueunited.com or tweet at KLeagueUnited with any questions, comments or reactions. Or follow us on Facebook to ask directly during one of our live shows.
Welcome back to the K-League United podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Walters, and this week we are doing a special, I would like to say a coaches roundtable, but I cannot include myself in that. So we'll say a coaches chat, I guess. Anyway, I am joined by Tom Orrock from Wae-In Sports and Taehan, a football analyst and lecturer here in Korea. And we were just talking about Confucian culture, which I foolishly put at the end. You have to talk about that first. So you have to get that out there. But I mean, really, though, we do, because you can't talk about anything Korean without talking about Confucian culture, and you really can't talk about Korean football specifically without talking about Confucian culture. And we started talking a little bit about youth development there, and there's just one other aspect of it that I wanted to hit on real quick before we move on to tactics and where the game is now tactically here in Korea, and maybe setting an identity and things like that. But before that, one of the things that really interests me here, and obviously this is my own bias and my own life experience coming into it, I see a lot of parallels between where the game is in America right now and where it is in Korea right now, because these are two nations that had a professional league come up at around the same time. They have both kind of come onto the global stage recently. Obviously, things have gone a little bit better for Korea and Asia than things have gone for the U.S. I don't want to talk about Trinidad and Tobago. We're not going to do that. But something that's happening in the United States right now is that a lot of our elite talent is being developed overseas. Christian Pulisic is somebody that has almost exclusively been trained in Germany. And we see that here in Korea as well. We had the Barca boys that we talked about a lot during the U20 World Cup with Lee Sung-woo, who we've already talked about a little bit, and Paek Sung-ho. And then right now, a really exciting youth talent that we've also already mentioned is Lee Kang-in, who's being developed in Valencia. And then there was also Son Heung-min, who technically came up through FC Seoul, but really was a product of the Bundesliga. And I'm just curious, and Tom, I'll start with you on this one. And again, I feel like this is one of the things that you're kind of trying to do here, is to get Korean talent developed in a different way here in Korea. So do you see there being a little bit of a change to have more of like the world-class talent come from Korean academies?
That would be the ideal.
Right.
That's what everybody wants. They want their assets to stay in country. The only problem is that we have an almost expectation of giving these prize key player positions to foreigners. You will find it difficult to have a team in the K-League 1 or 2 without a foreign striker. You know, a couple of Brazilian wingers, a reliable Japanese central midfielder, and a big Eastern European centre-back. What that does, unfortunately, to young players is pigeonhole them into wide roles or midfield roles.
Yeah.
And from a young age, they're targeting where they're able to get a reliable contract. So that's the discussion I have and have had a lot with guys when I was coaching in the K3. We had some real one player, Kang Taehan. I remember him very well. He was a 6'3" centre forward who was a product of the Wolfsburg youth team. He was a Rolls Royce on legs. He just shifted. The guy was ruthless finisher, put himself about, and he played with a real smile on his face. Mm-hmm. And here he was playing in the 5th division of the K-League. And it was no fault of his own. You know, he worked really hard. He didn't get picked up for his professional contract and came back here. And in that amount of time that he had lost by playing abroad, he had lost out on part of his playing CV. Something that put a question mark for all the coaches, and nobody was willing to take that chance when they knew they could get somebody who looked pretty good on YouTube coming over for, you know, a few $100s a week.
Yeah. I mean, and the techno beat and all of those skill videos.
That's what sells it.
I mean, you got to have a good techno beat. But yeah, we joke a lot on the podcast about, I swear every team just has a dartboard with Brazil pinned on it, and they just throw a dart and they're like, let's get a guy from that spot, because every team, it feels like, does have a Brazilian player on there. But I've never really thought about it from the youth perspective of looking up at the league and thinking, well, that's not really a spot that I can get, you know. And that's, you know, even we talk a lot about Kim Shin-uk lovingly, but he's a converted defender.
Yeah.
You know, and Go Johan for FC Seoul, he's somebody that's come up, he's now on the national team. He's playing striker sometimes for FC Seoul, but he came up as a defender and then kind of proved himself in the midfield and had to move forward. And this leads pretty perfectly into one of the other things that I wanted to talk about, which is lower division football here. And hopefully the pyramid's going to open up as soon as next year. Do you think that will change things? Are we going to be able to see more youth development here? I mean, that's the idea, but will it actually happen?
Wow. That would be the ideal scenario. Again, it would all depend on whether they have promotion relegation opportunities for the leagues. The only other thing for players as well, it's very difficult to create a successful team or culture around a team that exists only for a year. Sure. And for divisions from the K2 down, you're essentially offering a 12-month contract to any players, and that's very difficult to give them an incentive to stay, for them to play freely and successfully without stress. So hopefully it would give some transparency between the teams, and hopefully some teams will become affiliates and we'll see some younger players being loaned down.
Right.
And that would give us something to be excited about, and see players playing regularly rather than just the odd 2-minute substitute appearance.
Right.
So yeah, hopefully I can certainly see more positives than there are negatives to come out of that.
Yeah, and Taehan, is this something that you would be looking at with some of the lower division clubs? If this pyramid's able to open up where we have promotion relegation between, let's just say 3 divisions to start, because I think right now the National League and the current K3 Advanced. They're talking about merging those two and making that into a third division. If that happens, which fingers crossed, let's hope that it does, and there is promotion relegation, because let's face it, Dunham Dragons need more pressure on them. They know they do, and so does Soliland. They know it. Sorry. They do. They know it.
Why are you looking at me specifically?
I did. I mean, maybe I did, maybe I didn't. But if this is something that comes in, and again, the hope with these lower division sides is, yes, to have a fan base, and that hope of like eventually making the way up to K1. And wouldn't it be great if a K3 side was represented in the AFC Champions League at some point? Like just a dream scenario of that, of a Leicester City here in Korea, for example, right? But on a more day-to-day basis, I think the focus would be on youth development. And what would be an ideal situation in your mind, Taehan, of a culture that could be in place at one of these lower division clubs, and how it could help foster youth development here instead of sending the best, most promising players abroad? How do you think lower division clubs could help foster Korean talent here on Korean shores?
I think it depends on system and policy. So we need to have a more lone player system kind of thing. If you see the K League or Youth League, we have R League, Reserve League, and then if those kind of player can have a chance to play with K3 League players, that means they have a more experience to play with the experted player. So maybe yes, like a what Bundesliga or
in England as well, they have the same merged league.
Yeah. So maybe if we can give chance to young player to play with a little bit old age group,
and then hopefully they can have that a little bit more communication,
exactly,
like we were talking about before.
Yeah,
a positive byproduct of it. Yeah.
Hopefully, and yeah, again, hopefully this is something that we'll see in place here in Korea as soon as next year, where the pyramid might be opening up as soon as 2020, and then again, the hope is that we would have a little bit more of the young talent here getting developed. But in order for that to happen, there have to be some good tactics in place. So we're going to take another little quick break, and then we're going to come back, and we're just going to dig in to the nerdy stuff. So if you're not listening for the nerdy stuff, you're on the wrong episode. But we'll be right back.
Looking to spend some downtime with friends and fellow gamers in Seoul? Drop by Retro Game Bar. Located in Hongdae near Sangsu Station Exit 1, RGB is a retro game-inspired bar where you can play any and all types of games, test their bartenders' drink mixing capabilities, or watch a gamecast of your choosing. For those with a competitive side, sign up for monthly tournaments including Tekken, Mario Kart, and K-League United's FIFA 19 competitions. Follow RGB on Facebook for tournament info and details on other events throughout the month. Mention that you're a fan of K-League United to their hard-working bartenders when you stop by for a starter shot to kick off the evening. Game on!
Welcome back to the K-League United podcast. I am your host, Ryan Walters, and this week I am joined by Tom Orrock and Bae Taehan, and we are talking about all of the nerdy things, all of the stuff. But yeah, we've been talking about Confucian culture. We've been talking about youth development here in Korea, and one of the things that we keep touching on today, it's something that we talk about a lot on the podcast regularly, is kind of having an identity for Korean football. And one of the things I cannot start this conversation anywhere else than at the back, because I talk about this all the time, and you guys are actually in the thick of things here. Why are goalkeepers taught to punch the ball all the time? Why? Neither one of you want to answer it.
No,
someone
certainly
has
not.
to give me some kind of answer.
I shouldn't be admitting this, but I also have a goalkeeping coaching badge as well.
Okay.
So I've done 3 levels of this, and this is in Scotland. We're not famous for our goalkeepers, well, since 50 years. But this isn't something that I have ever seen taught as a skill, other than when I came to Korea.
I was going to say, but it is something that, like, for those that haven't seen it, and that does include me, but like at younger levels, is it being taught to punch the ball instead of catching it?
Absolutely.
It boggles my mind. I can't understand. And this is something that we see a lot in K-League. And recently we saw a keeper punch it right to an opposing striker who just popped it back in for a goal. I mean, that's the obvious huge downside of it, but it's just something that really, it just kills me on corner kicks or any kind of easy clearance where you could get possession for your team and start from the back, which is something that I feel like Korean football does want to build around starting from the back. And we'll talk about that with the overly defensive nature here. But what are some of the justifications for it?
I think from a coaching point of view, I'm just playing devil's advocate here from watching.
Please.
If the youth team is fortunate enough to have a goalkeeper coach in the first place, and I've been to, I won't name them, but I've been to K-League training grounds and watched youth teams at the highest level watch their goalkeepers go through their own routines for several hours, several times a day, devoid of a coach. But if you are fortunate enough to have a goalkeeper coach, that is something that they will look to treat as a skill to be taught, as with anything else that they teach their goalkeepers. And it's unfortunate because I think it's something that doesn't come into the whole player philosophy of ticking all the boxes of tactical, social, psychological skills that a goalkeeper needs more than almost anybody on the pitch.
Right. And Taehan, feel free to weigh in on this, because it does kind of lead into, it feels like things are too defensive. It feels like things are too defensive in K-League. It feels like things are too defensive with the national team. And I feel like this propensity to punch, it's just shooting the defense in the foot, because you're giving them too many 50-50 balls that they're not going to win, that they're not set up to win, and the midfielders aren't in a place to move the ball forward. So instead of me just complaining about goalkeepers punching, I just had to bring it up. I had to. Would you say, Taehan, that there is too much of a defensive focus right now, or is that something that, as an outsider, that I'm just seeing too much?
Absolutely. May I talk about the goalkeeper punching as well?
Oh, please.
Yeah, because I think
we can have a whole podcast on this.
Good.
I think definitely it also links with Confucianism as well.
Okay.
I'm sorry to come back to that topic,
No, I agree with you
We
completely.
We have to.
But because if you are coach,
Mm-hmm.
if you think your goalkeeper try to catching the ball,
Then the goalkeeper's trying to set the tone. Oh, fascinating.
that means because in Korea, in a young age group, we have to win, because if you are elementary level, you need to go middle school, and then you need to go high school, and then you need to go university. So if you don't win, you can't go further. So players and coach used to live in that kinds of environment. So maybe in my mind, if you ask why Korean goalkeeper do not catching, only punching, it's also related with that kinds of things.
Fascinating. Yeah, because, I've never thought about it that way before, but if the keeper's catching it, then they're saying, okay, I'm going to dictate the pace of play. I'll decide when the ball comes out, when we move forward. But if they're punching it, then that's kind of leaving things up to the tactics and everything else that the coach has put in place, which
Precisely.
again, that's the keeper has to default to the manager because he's older, he's more experienced. Fascinating. I finally have an answer. You did it. Kind of blew my mind on that one. It does lead into the defensive nature of things. And again, a lot of what we're talking about here is changing things a little bit. And it shouldn't, it should be said that obviously things aren't broken here. The Korean football is doing quite well. It was a decent World Cup showing. Qualifications never really that much of a concern. And with an expanded World Cup coming up, let's face it, probably in Qatar, qualification's not an issue, but it is one of those things. It hasn't mattered too much who's the manager of the national team. There doesn't seem to be an identity for the team as much as it's just don't concede. Is it something that's been in place for a long time to just be overly defensive and maybe get one on the counter? And is that something that you think might be able to change?
When we talk about the why we play defensive game, we need to talk about how football has been changed so far. It's because it's not only Korean football problem about the tactic. Because when you talk about when you see the 2018 World Cup, lots of a weak team try to do counter attack because it's football. If football has been market and the market has been really big now, so if you lose $1 billion. So manager or player, they try to make a choice. So you have a two choice: keep the ball or keep the ball and then keep the space. I think why, if you ask me why Korean team normally have a defensive game, maybe cultural background, and also the money.
Interesting. Tom, I'll bring this one back to you. Do you think that that's something that is hindering youth players? Because you said you've worked a lot with youth players. Is that something that mentality from the back, is that affecting the midfielders and the forwards?
Absolutely, it has a complete knock-on effect. And like we were talking about before, it's mindset. And I'm not saying that there's a right mindset for every team. There's no one way to coach football, but a fixed mindset is only going to get you so far. And I think setting off from your manager, starting with your goalkeeper, going through your defense is a natural progression, and allowing, especially at youth level, for players to cycle, play different positions, understand the responsibility and the role that each of those positions have, and then being able to share in the way that they play. They should be able to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes. And too often do we see players getting subbed off or scolded for making difficult passes, and that's something that happens at a young age. I'm not sure what the transition is, but like you were talking about 2v2s and 4v4s, that's the perfect example of teaching responsibility about two simple roles in the game of football, is attacking and defending. That is a great introduction to those responsibilities, and you have only one person to communicate with.
Right.
When you get to the higher youth level, there's a lot of considerations, there's a lot of tactics going on, but it's always the same dynamic of, am I attacking, am I defending?
Right.
Do I feel comfortable to take a risk? And unfortunately, the players are always deferring back to the previous. Who did I receive that ball from? What are they trying to communicate to me? What is my manager thinking about when he looks at me? And I've seen it all the way up to the international level. I've seen Kim Shin looking over his shoulder before he makes a pass, because he knows how slated he's going to be if he tries to play a 60-yard pass, because he's never made one.
Right.
But he can see somebody's bolting down the wing. And essentially it's that message of support that you need to give to your young players, especially, that you can take people on. What is the outcome of this youth game? Who is watching this? What are we trying to get out of this? Are we trying to win this game? Do we get some benefit from winning this game, or should we really change the mentality or the mindset towards growth, and what our players get out of it as people rather than just players? Focusing on the process and the lesson rather than just the result at the end of the day.
Right, and one of the things that I think kind of also plays into that is watching the international game. And this is where I feel like the obsession with possession football, I think that lowering, and Taehan, you brought up counterattacking, and I feel like we're seeing that more and more. And again, Leicester showed that to us. But here in Korea right now, Daegu's doing a fantastic job of playing counterattacking football. And we also see a lot of mimicry with what's happening in the EPL and what's happening in Europe with K-League coaches. So do you think that as we kind of transition away from possession-dominated football in a lot of ways, and I think that's probably going to come back at some point, just like we're seeing so many more teams finally revert back to a 4-4-2. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. I love a 4-4-2. But anyway, do you think that as we're seeing possession and the emphasis put on possession kind of get lowered, do you think that will allow for a little bit more creativity within Korean football, or maybe a change in approach from playing from the back? Or is playing from the back a case like a 4-4-2 where, hey, if it ain't broke, don't fix it?
I think the system is not really important to talk about the creativity, because anyway, if you play counter-attack, you need to create a player, because you need to break down, and then he need to make a decision making when he gonna shot and when he gonna pass it. But let's talk about why Korean football want to have possession game. Because if you have the ball, that means you have more chance to score. There's only one reason. Because football has a 4 situation every time: in possession, out of possession, transition. So if you wanna have more ball in possession, that means you have a more chance to score. So then the reason why you wanna have the ball.
Do you think, and it feels like we're talking about the national team a lot, and this could also relate to a lot of K-League teams, is there a certain identity for Korean football that you think would be the ideal, or is a defensive-natured play it from the back kind the ideal? Because again, qualification's never been a problem for Korea, and of the Asian nations, Korea's done quite well for themselves on the global stage. But again, we are talking about changes and maybe adapting things. So is there an overarching tactic? Because obviously you're going to approach different games differently depending on who your opponent is. But is there kind of an identity that you would like to see Korea have? Like for me, I want them to be more attacking because I think the talent is there.
Same for me.
Yeah.
Same for me. Yeah. Of course, I want to see like attacking football as well. But as I said before, like a system is not really important because why I want to have that one is because just on educational reason, not about system. Because if you have a more ball, that means like you have a more decision making on the game. So I wish young player see the national team and K-League team. So okay, they have the ball and they play possession game. So when I do possession game, and if you are a young player, okay, I need to make a decision making kind of thing. So
Sure.
I wish like they can learn that kinds of things from that level. Why I talk about this one is because I need to go about the coaching style as well. Because as I said, in Korean youth level, it's important to win instead of the process because you need to go higher.
Is that something that you... And I feel like Tom has made his stance on it clear. I know where I stand on it. Is that something that you hope to see change, or do you think that there are a lot of merits in teaching a winning mentality from the beginning? I mean, because to be honest, we want people that are amazingly competitive to be professional athletes. And I know there is a trend towards more focus on maybe the simpler aspects of the game, Tom, like you were saying, of just are you attacking, are you defending, and quicker decision making within the twos. But like, is there merit to the idea of instilling a winning mentality from a youth age, or is that something that you're trying to help change as well?
It depends. It very depends. Like it depends on the age group as well. Because if you are 15 or 16, of course, development is more important. So when you do performance analysis in youth level, you don't do opponent one because you need to focus on yours because development is more important than winning the game. But if you are 18 or 23, of course, so it depends on the age group. But of course, in youth level, the basic concept is development. So,
and I was just thinking about this as we're having this conversation. Are there any K-League teams that you think, and Tom, I'll switch back to you in just 1 second, but I'm going to keep putting you under the microscope here, Taehan. Are there any K-League teams that are playing that possession-based attacking football that you think could be a good model moving forward? Other than Jeonnam Dragons, obviously.
I want to ask you, do you think which Korean team playing possession game now?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, right? Because Jeonbuk does by default, because I think Jeonbuk has the most talented team. I think they can play counterattacking. They do in Champions League sometimes, but I think teams are often intimidated by Jeonnam, or not Jeonnam. That's a Freudian slip. I wish teams were intimidated by Jeonnam. Teams are intimidated by Jeonbuk, and so they sit back and they absorb that pressure, and then they try to hit on the counter. But I don't know if that's necessarily a systemic thing, if that's something that Jeonbuk has in place that could be replicated, because it's hard to replicate a team that's just unquestionably the most talented. I think, well, Jeju used to play a really entertaining, a few years ago when they were playing the Tangerine Taka, they had a really good possession-based, fun attacking game, and then the bottom kind of fell out, unfortunately. So I think there are models for it here, but I don't know if there's been a consistent one. And again, maybe that comes down to a lack of an identity. But Tom, I'll put you under the microscope here. Is there a K-League team that you think is playing a brand of football, not even necessarily possession-based, but just a style of football that you think could be a good one to emulate, as we are looking at more youth level and lower division clubs kind of coming up?
Judged on purely the football that I've been to see this season, I couldn't give you a straightforward answer of what anybody's game plan has been, specifically in the first 20 minutes. And maybe because we're early in the season and we've had a lot of changes and there's still a lot of training to be had. But the only consistent philosophy I see is just run hard.
Right.
I think that's what people is. I think that's what the players think is expected of them. That's what the coaches expect of their players. And that's what you see from the national team, certainly at the very top. The only downside to that is that it's draining, incredibly draining. I've never seen teams flat out on their feet down to the last player after every single game. And that is, I mean, I've seen players cramping up. A good example was, the first game of the World Cup, Park Ju-ho, first sprint into the game, 60 meters, pulls his hamstring.
Yeah.
And that's just down to immense overtraining and expectations on the players. So if I were to have an ideal, I would say that it is, you have this fantastic glut of energy and talent and technical ability. And how do we apply that? How do we go from running hard to running smart? And I think the first team that uses data analysts and is able to be able to assess game on game how they're performing will get the most out of it, and will gain a huge advantage. And I can only see that being John Book at the moment in terms of support.
Yeah, unfortunately, John Book might be the only one that's coming to mind, and kind of like you were saying with some of the trainings, the teams that you've seen in place. I won't name the team or the manager for this, but I've talked to players in the league that said they don't have film sessions. They're not even watching film right now.
No.
Which, and again, to keep the focus on tactics, what do you think needs to change, or what needs to come into place for us to see some of those things that, and again, I feel like, Tom, for you and me, it might just be Westerners seeing this in a different way. What would you like to see through Wae-In and coaches education? What are some of the things that you're trying to put in place that might find their way into the lower divisions or K2 or even K1?
Well, I'm very fortunate I get to work with SPT, Train Like Pros, which is run by Moon Hong. So I have, we work together at Seoul United, infamously, for a short period.
Follow him on Twitter.
I'm very fortunate. I have great access to a large body of young players who are incredibly motivated by one common goal, which is to be professional. And I recall very well my first training session with them was, they typically gathered around me in a perfect circle, bowed in unison, and were prepared to run themselves into the ground. And the first challenge for them was to take off their boots and sit down. And they needed to give me exactly where we were going to be at the end of the season. And that was what I wanted to do straight from the off, was shift the focus away from me as this foreign coach. I'm not here. I'm not a magician. I'm not the best coach, but to shift the power onto them and start taking down the ideas of what are their personal goals, where do they want to be in 12 months time, and we're going to review. And by the end of that session, we had half a dozen guys who just finished their military service, and they're in tears because they're unable to imagine a world where they're not professional. And the chances are, out of these 30 guys, none of them are going to make it.
Sure.
1 in 3,000 are going to make it. So shifting the mentality and the mindset onto the players and giving them the responsibility would be the ideal. And that's kind of what we do with our coaching workshops as well. We bring coaches in and they work collaboratively together. And like Taehan was saying, everything is posed in the form of questions. We have ideas of what an ideal coach would look like, but we want to know what their ideal coach looks like, because it doesn't necessarily translate across borders. So they have to have an idea of who their role model is. Who are they aiming to be like? Let's unbox that person. What qualities do they possess? How did they get to where they're going? Okay, so if that's your identity and your role model and who you want to be as a coach, the role of a coach is to support players. So what does the whole player look like? What does the player look like at the end of the day? Let's unbox that. How are they supported? How can we best support them? And I think this is very macro and it's very philosophical, and it's lovely to talk about. We can talk about it all day, but the value of creating that culture around the players and around a core group, it takes a lot of the sting off of the manager. It takes the focus away from you, and it empowers players to perform, not because they feel pressure being taken out, but because they realize they're united by something, whether it's one another or whether it's a common philosophy. So the best advice I give to any coach or any manager who I meet is listen to your players. Just get to know your players, because football is what they do, but it's not who they are.
Yeah, I think, and that's one of the other things that with our player interviews and things like that, we always try to talk about players or people. And I think that definitely plays into that. And Taehan, I got to throw it back to you on this one, because we're back to Confucian culture again. Because how could we not be? Like that is a great philosophy to have of a player-led team, and I think we've seen managers that they're like a player's manager. Jurgen Klopp, somebody that comes to mind right now, of somebody that's obviously a player's manager. The players want to play for him. Do you think that we're close to seeing a Korean manager that's a player's manager? Is there anybody that you have in mind that's like that right now, or do you think that maybe in a few years we will have that, or is that something that's just, it's not for Korea and that's just not going to be the case here?
The only question I would have for you, or playing devil's advocate, is why?
Right.
What is their incentive to do that?
But that's a really fair question, though, right? Because,
yeah.
I mean, if you're the manager of the team, in a lot of ways, you're God. You know? Like, people just have to listen to what you're going to say. And again, not naming names, but like we've talked to some players that have just absolutely fallen out with the manager, foreign players, and they get moved on, or they get put on the bench or something else like that. Whereas they'll have conversations with their Korean teammates and they'll share those frustrations, but their Korean teammates aren't having those same kind of conversations with the manager because, again, I feel like it's not, well, like we've talked about right at the beginning, it's not this communal relationship. It's a top-down relationship. Yeah. So, yeah, is that something that you see changing? But I mean, you know, like Tom said,
you still see Korean players dissenting the managers. Not to their faces, but I've seen it at the top level of captains of professional teams who go away and form a core group almost against their manager and will literally switch off for 8 months.
I'm not sure Jurgen Klopp is person who every time listen player.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean like because you are manager, you need to show a lot of different character every time. It depends on player and depends on the situation. So I think like a Korean coach is normally very dictative. Yeah.
Authoritative, I guess.
Yeah. But what I wanna see and then what you suggest, I think what you wanna listen is like, can we see more different type of the character from one person? I think yes, because when I do lecture with young coaches, they are actually doing now. They try to make a question to young player, and then they try to listen, and then they try to give video clips, and then they try to talk with them. So I think definitely one day we're gonna see that kind of things. But you know, it's really hard that type of the young coach come up to the professional level one time. So
right,
yeah, we will see, and I hope
it's accelerated by the integration of data. So Fit Together is a really good example of a Korean company creating data analysis tools that are accessible and affordable to K-League teams, and you're starting to see it everywhere. And that's run by a couple of young Korean lads who've managed to get this going. And as long as teams accept that, you know, this contract has been taken up and the information is all there, the data is boundless.
Yeah,
they just need somebody who's going to translate that into how they want to use it. You know, the opportunities are here if people are willing to accept them, whether they're 30 years old as a coach or 50.
Yeah. Embracing change. We'll see. We'll see how the K-League managers do with that. But I think for now we're gonna have to end it now because we do have some time constraints and other things like that. But I mean, I could keep going, or maybe we'll just have to pick this up for a part 2 at some point.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Again, Tom Orrock of Wae-In Sports. And Tom, where can people find you online if they're looking for you?
You can find us at www.waein.com, or you can find us on Instagram, Wae-In Sports, or also Facebook as well.
And for those that aren't familiar with how Korean is Romanized, that's Waein.
Correct.
Yeah. Just like, well, we're not going to go into all the Romanizations and how wrong they are. But Taehan, where can people find you if they're looking for you online?
Maybe you can research my name on Facebook, TAEHNBAE.
Yeah. Just
new
Facebook friend for everybody. You're gonna have some weird requests coming in. Anyway,
no way.
Well, after you add him on Facebook, if you would like to stay involved in social media, we are currently giving away a Taehan new, not match worn, unfortunately, but it is an official K-League kit that we were able to pick up in our little goodie grab bag from the league. So all you have to do for that is to subscribe to YouTube, and we'll get you in there to enter and win that potentially. And don't forget, if you want to listen to us every Thursday, you can do so on Football Nation Radio down in Australia. And you can also subscribe via iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, and wherever you download your podcasts. And as has been the theme for the past couple of months, if you leave a review, and this goes for you guys too, hey, why not? We'll get you in on there. If you want to leave a review for the podcast, we will enter you into a chance to win some K-League gear, which I'm sure you guys don't
Consider
have.
It done.
Yeah, you don't have any of that laying around. You need more. So for those of you listening that might not have a closet full of gear, if you would like to win some K-League gear, just leave a review and we will enter you into a contest to win that as well. But for now, gentlemen, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this one. Thanks for listening.
전교석 공격 폭격기 김신